Prime Minister, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and those following us online today, good morning. As Secretary General of the Norwegian Atlantic Committee, it is a great honor for me to welcome you to the 59th edition of the oldest and still existing conference in Norway about security policy, the Leangkollen Security Conference. April 4th, NATO turns 75 years old. November 5th, NATO's strongest member state will elect a new president. Both candidates for the presidency are older than the alliance, and their view on NATO's future differ considerably. Thus, the title of this year's conference gives itself, NATO 75, Past, Present and Future, Transatlantic Security in an Era of Strategic Competition and a year of US elections. When the alliance celebrates its anniversary at the Washington summit this summer, there is no denying that it will take place in a moment of great instability in world politics. There are brutal wars, both in Europe and in the Middle East. Russia's war in Ukraine, which is going into its third winter, has put the European security system under severe pressure and has great implications for the present and future global order. Although the war has led to strong unity among its transatlantic partners in their support to Ukraine, the will to support is gradually waning. Now, with a military stalemate, cracks are showing. Will the US and its NATO allies be able to stand united with Ukraine for as long as it takes? And what is it? What is the end state of this war, and who decides that? Moreover, as we head closer to the US general elections this fall, there is growing concern for what a new US administration might mean for the transatlantic relationship. As the US is increasingly shifting its focus away from Europe towards the Asia-Pacific, many now fear that a second Trump presidency might accelerate an American retreat from the continent and possibly from NATO. Europe must take more responsibility for its own security. But will the key European actors be able to align their diverging security interests, their different threat perceptions, and the alliance political and military coherence without America? Russia's war in Ukraine has brought deep changes to the alliance. The transatlantic partners find themselves in a new era of geostrategic competition, and NATO is facing a new era of collective defense. 2024 began with strong warnings from a string of Western leaders that European citizens need to be ready for a possibly military conflict with Russia in the future. What does this require from NATO's member states regarding spending, capabilities, and personnel, to mention a few keywords? Russia's war has also brought Finland and soon Sweden into the alliance. With the Nordic enlargement, we are witnessing a reshaping of Northern European security and defense, which constitutes NATO's northern flank. However, in strategic terms, we Nordics differ because Norway has a high north focus, while Finland and Sweden has a Baltic one. Thus, how will the changed security dynamics in the Nordic region affect NATO? And how should the Nordics and Norway adapt to this new security environment? During the next 2 days, ladies and gentlemen, we will bring all these topics to the podium, discuss their geopolitical implications and their consequences for NATO and the transatlantic partners. With us, we have a fantastic lineup of distinguished Norwegian and international speakers from numerous transatlantic nations. Thus, taking the past and present into account, we will seek to answer how the future will look like for the strongest and most successful military alliance in history, as NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg liked to frame it. With these words, I would like to give the floor to the chair of the board, Grete Farmo, who will give a proper welcome and introduce our first speaker this morning. Farmo has an impressive political and international career, among others as Norway's defense minister. And just let me remind you that you can find extensive bios of all speakers as well as descriptions of the different sessions in our conference program. I will also ask you to turn off your cell phones. Please, Grete, the floor is yours.
Prime Minister, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and as the chair of the board of the Norwegian Atlantic Committee, it is a great honor and privilege for me as well to welcome you all to the 59th edition of the Leangkollen Security Conference, a cherished event for all who are interested in foreign security and defense policies. So, no surprise, we moved it from Leangkollen Hotel to this beautiful aula in the university to host you all. Formed in 1955, the Norwegian Atlantic Committee has become one of Norway's most important and respected arenas for discussion on foreign security and defense policy, with emphasis on transatlantic relations. And I would also like to use this opportunity to express my warm thanks to the small secretariat of the Norwegian Atlantic Committee under the able hands of its Secretary General, Kate Hansen-Bundt, for organizing this event. This year, our discussions are framed within the context of NATO's 75th anniversary, as we heard. And during the next 2 days, we will reflect on NATO's history, assess its current relevance, and contemplate its future role in the face of new and challenging global dynamics, marked in particular by the war in Ukraine. And to shed light on these highly relevant topics, the Norwegian Atlantic Committee has invited eminent international and Norwegian experts and politicians. And simply by looking at the names, I am more than certain that they will give us fruitful knowledge and wisdom about a geopolitical and geostrategic landscape that the transatlantic partners are facing now and in the future. So why not begin at the top? It is my great pleasure and privilege to introduce the Prime Minister of Norway. Jonas Gahr Støre, the floor is yours.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for this opportunity. I am older than the Leangkollen conference, but younger than NATO. So I'm well positioned to address you here. And thank you, Leangkollen, for having moved from Leangkollen to this aula. And I think it's great to have Munch in the back. And if you need to see the scream, you have to go elsewhere, because here you have the sun, which is inspiring us, and I think that's a proper scene. And thank you for putting this very topical agenda. And one could have had a long historic perspective on NATO past, present, and future, starting with about 12 members, and now we are above 30. And as you said, Grete and Kate, it's the most successful and long-lasting military alliance in history. That was also the message when I was taught security policy 40 years ago. So it has gone through sequences which are worthwhile studying. And I think that the main message here is that it is, during the years, about the ability of collective security. That's where it is. In the 90s, after the Cold War, there was this question, what is the purpose? And I can remember back then, are we really in need of NATO? And we had a discussion of whether we go out of area or we go out of business. But now I believe we are very much back to the modern notion of collective security, what that means. And for Norway, that is critical and key. Now, the backdrop to my remarks today is, of course, the international scene, the 75th anniversary and the summit in Washington. We are all starting to prepare for that, important as it is. Half of the world population, or a bit more, will go to the polls, which is not necessarily a sign of strong democracies around the world, but it's a sign that big states will have elections, and it will have an impact. It is against the backdrop of the war in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East, and instability in many sequences, many parts of the world. It's against the backdrop of a major industrial revolution going on with artificial intelligence. And it's against the backdrop also of extreme weather from climate change, also affecting security quite profoundly. And it is against the background of deep transitions in our societies. All NATO member states are facing that. Energy transition, climate transition, and demographic transition. So all of these elements are exposing, I would say, our notion of security. It's not NATO's business to deal with all of that, but it is interconnected. And I think if we kind of disconnect these different elements, we don't grasp the whole picture. So my message here is that we need to be prepared. I speak now as a Norwegian Prime Minister, primarily, of course, responsible for Norway's security. We need to be prepared militarily, politically, and morally to live with this security environment that is around our country and globally. And that means that we have to be prepared to deal with potential military threats to the integrity of our borders and our sovereignty, be they direct or indirect hybrid. We need to deal with upheavals in local communities through extreme weather and surprises that can turn upside down local communities. That's also a major preparedness. And we need to be prepared, I think, morally to deal with a wave of fake news, conspiracy theories, and things that are really unsettling the way we shape our opinions. And it involves all of our society, and here we have a strong element of our military, and I appreciate that. This morning, before coming here, I had a breakfast meeting with the President and Secretary General of the Norwegian Red Cross. I just felt coming down here, being a former Secretary General of the Red Cross myself, how important that organization is for the civil mobilization of preparedness. And they had two messages for me. One was to report back from Ukraine, where they have been with a very extensive program, Red Cross cooperating, as part of the Nansen program that we have established as Norway's 5-year support package to Ukraine. And now the Norwegian Red Cross can support civil preparedness in Ukraine when they are under attack. Very important. And the second part of their message was, how do we strengthen preparedness in Finnmark, in our northernmost county, to deal with weather, preparedness, everything happening in the high north. So that's the other side of the preparedness equation. So what is this security environment? I mean, we could have not only 2 days, but many days of seminar on that. And let me just mention before I come to my 4 points of response to the question of what it means to Norway. Obviously, Russia's full-scale aggression against Ukraine is a watershed. That Europe is dealing with this as one way of settling issues between countries, full-fledged war. 2 years ago, some were convinced that this was about to happen, and some still could not really envisage that this was a modern response to modern challenges. But it did happen, and it is, of course, a disaster for the Ukrainian people. But it is also unsettling security perceptions of many European states, be they bordering Russia or victims of other kinds of instability. So there's the Russian war and the deep sense of insecurity in Europe that is really part now of our security architecture. How do we deal with that? Individually as countries, and all my colleagues, be meeting many of them in Munich in a couple of weeks, are grappling with the answers from their national perspective, but of course also how do we lift it into a collective security perspective. Then there is the war in the Middle East, dramatic and tragic in itself, and as we see now, day by day, with its consequences and potential spreading effect beyond the immediate borders of Gaza or the West Bank. There is China, there is Asia, there are unsettled issues, Taiwan, tensions rising, US focus shifting both ways. There is Africa with the conflicts that are often forgotten, be they in Sudan, be they at the Horn of Africa. And around that continent, spreading also insecurity, deep tragic for the people living there, but also pressure on Europe from the south. And then again, we have to factor in issues like the COVID pandemic, what it did to economies. This is also part of the security environment. The north-south divide. Is the global south really trusting what we are saying from the global north? Do our messages have credibility when we try to sound the alarm bell of what is going on in Ukraine, if we handle the Middle East quite differently? These are fundamental questions for the security environment. And then there is the question about democracies themselves. There are 4 or 5 billion people voting, but there are also strong publications coming out from historians saying this is how democracies die, or this is how democracies are threatened from the inside. And if we talk about security for our countries, we cannot neglect the quality of our democracies. Are people voting? Is the truth being spoken? Is the press able to do its job? So these are many elements. I'll try to boil down this to 4 answers from a Norwegian perspective to deal with our security. First of all, how we fix our own defense, our national defense, that is key. Second, on NATO, what will be NATO's role? What will be our contribution? Third, the historic fact that the Nordics will be, for the first time in modern times, united in the same security alliance. And my fourth remark is really, are we trusting who we really are? What are our core values to stand up against all this? First, on our national defense. We are now preparing a national defense plan, a long-term plan. And it's being prepared in the same mode of approach as we voted the 5-year support plan for Ukraine. We invite all parties in Parliament to come together and elaborate and work on that plan. On the Nansen package for Ukraine, 5-year plan, we managed to get all parties in Parliament along. I think that was important. I think we are the only country in Europe where there is completely cross-party support in Parliament for our package to Ukraine. And I take note of the fact that the European Union last week voted a 4-year package. And I think, our 5-year approach has had some impact on that. That the money and the contribution themselves, the weapons we are able to contribute, the quality of that is important. But the 5-year thing is also very important, because it gives a perspective that we are not there for only the next year, but there's a long perspective. So we work in that mode. We have made clear that we will be at the 2% level in 2026 or before. We will see. It depends a bit on how it goes, but we are really focused on being part of that pledge. 30% will go for investments, which is above the NATO target, but that's where we will be modernizing our defense. But this is only a first step. So there are 3 major elements in how we approach this long-term plan. The first one is to make our current structure work better and to make it relevant to the challenges ahead. That will require 3 major engagements. One is on resources. We will need more resources to fund the structure. Secondly, we will need more people to man the structure, which means that part of the money we've been mobilizing so far is really about increasing intake at our military schools, training people, getting that capacity up, building new buildings to house them. And the third one is to fill up our ammunition stocks. And you all know that that Western production has taken a peace dividend, and it's now time to invest in the insecurity risk factor. That's how it is. But my message to the Norwegian society is the following. There are two areas where we know we will have to invest more as a community in the years ahead. It is in health and care services, and it is in military capacity. And both of those sectors, unfortunately, prices are not coming down. They are going up. So we're going to need to spend more on something which is probably going to be more expensive. And if the equation is going to work out, it means that we will have to make tougher priorities. So first one, make our current structure work. Secondly, when we envisage our defense plan for the coming years, we should take fully note that Norway is in the high north, and Norway is an ocean state. I wouldn't make a too big drama out of the fact that this is who we are. Geography matters. And Sweden and Finland have other geographies. So the big task here, I'll come back to that, is to make these agendas work, which is a unique opportunity. But Norway will have to take its responsibilities seriously. We have coast. We are NATO's eyes and ears up in the north, following what is happening there, providing both stability and deterrence. So we have to invest in a capacity that can maintain that same quality in the years to come. I believe that the notion of deterrence and reassurance is the right equation. But what matters is that the deterrence has to be credible. So we have to make it credible in the way we invest, train, and exercise our responsibility. But the reassurance point for me is really about how we are recognizable, long-term, and predictable. And I think Norway has stood the lessons during these 75 years of NATO as an ally to be predictable long-term. So we have been able, to a certain extent, to keep this notion of high north, low tension. And it's not in our interest to seek the other way around. Let's do high tension in the high north. So the high north will determine this in a key way. Also because our allies are, for obvious reason, more interested in the Arctic, the high north, the Barents Sea. And when they sail and fly and exercise in the north, we want to be along them. I think that's a way of reassuring and creating and sharing our experience. So make the current structure better, invest in the high north, and increase, my third point, the capacity of allied reinforcement, which is key for Norway. We have to have a strong defense to address our security in the immediate terms, but then we depend on the alliance functioning and working. I was up with the defense minister in Bardufoss-Akkaseter region up in Troms 2 weeks ago to see how we are building capacities for training, for reception, and for exercising with our allies what it means to do winter training and what it means to reach our borders. We are deepening our bilateral agreements with the UK and now lately with the US. We had these 4 areas of dedicated military areas with the US for the agreement adopted 2 years ago. And last week we put to Parliament the proposal of another 8 areas that will be agreed with the US to create predictability and training for how we do that. So these are main elements of how we envisage our long-term defense plan. And we will do that in good parliamentary tradition, but I think we are on a good path to work and deal with our partners in Parliament and on both sides of the aisle, hopefully to reach a broad consensus as broad as we can. So that was the defense. Second one on NATO. Let me be pretty brief on that, to say that we see from the Norwegian side that what happened in Vilnius last year was a major achievement of making NATO relevant and up to where it needs to be at this moment. And I remember from my time as foreign minister, and Foreign Minister Espen Barth Eide and I worked on, and Grete, you were there too, on what we said, taking NATO back home to its geography. And we had key people in our defense who knew more about Afghan mountains than about Norwegian fjords. So, there needs to be a balance here. And I think what happened in Vilnius, what summarized in Vilnius, was a very important achievement in that sense. 4,000 pages from Sakør about new regional defense plans, which are updated and relevant, and where we all find our role, and our national defense plan will have to fit with these NATO regional plans. A new regional command structure, where Norway is under Norfolk, and I think it's a common Nordic intention, Admiral, to be under the Norfolk command structure together, which highlights the transatlantic dimension, which is so key to NATO. We have contributed to the forward planning. We have 150 Norwegian troops in Lithuania, much stronger and deeper security dialogue with our Baltic friends. And I will be going to Poland to see Prime Minister Tusk in a couple of weeks, also to deepen that relationship between Norway and Poland, which is important in many senses. We have also taken new initiatives, as I did with Chancellor Scholz, to increase NATO's contribution to energy infrastructure security, which I think is a modern private-public partnership between NATO and the private industry to look after this critical infrastructure for our security. So here I believe that NATO is responding and has been doing that under Secretary General Stoltenberg over the last year, responding to what the needs really are and getting the essence of what 31, 32 member states can unite around. There will always be debate, and there will always be maximizing differences of views, but these are democracies and they find solutions. I think that is the hopeful message. So that is on NATO. Third point on the Nordics, just a few words. I mean, it is historic, could be another week of seminars. How did it go that all 5 Nordics are now finally in the military alliance? If we just take the post-Second World War years, there were political leaders, especially in my political movement, dreaming about a Nordic defense alliance. We could come together and be some kind of group in the Scandinavian peninsula to defend ourselves. That didn't work. They did not manage to create a common currency. They did not manage to create a common market. But they did great on making cross-border circulation easier, passport-free travel. But it took the European dimension to create a market. And it took a European dimension to create a currency, for the time being, for Finland, part of that. And it took the Euro-Atlantic structure to bring us together in an alliance. And of course, this is the immediate result of the war in Ukraine. And I think it's been some of the most memorable experiences of my 2.5 years as Prime Minister to work with my Finnish and Swedish colleagues in a very open, transparent way. What does it mean to be NATO member and Nordic? What does it mean? What are the obligations? And I think the trust we've had in that cooperation during these historic moments for our neighbors is something to build on in the future. But now we have an opportunity to look at the whole Scandinavian peninsula as one integral system. Not that this is new. We have worked on defense planning, exercising for the last 15, 20 years in a good way. But now we can do it with interoperability under the same rules, and we can plan in the same way. We can train, we can purchase, and we can look at the whole geographic area as one. It will, of course, link the Barents Arctic with the Baltic, but I think the opportunity of using our resources in a more effective way is quite significant, especially in the Air Force dimension. 250 very modern planes that can now start to work together and make the most out of each other. There are 1,300 kilometers of border between Finland and Russia. And there are 200 kilometers at Norway on the top. And I believe that this neighbor relationship has to be managed with care. And I repeat, as I do in every message, the Nordics are a threat to none. It was 1,000 years since we did that kind of business. But now we want to be a region of stability. And I think it is good for NATO to have another 2 Nordic countries around the table, also politically, as we meet to set the course. But then my last point, friends, which is part of this collective security thing, and that is to be more aware of who we are and what are the values that we build on. Because deep down, NATO is not only a military alliance, it is a political military alliance. It has to be a group of countries, in my mind, that look at how we deal with issues, how we develop societies, how we develop interrelations, by having also the political perspective. There are not obvious military solutions to every outstanding issue on our continent. So that has to be something we have to contribute to collectively. Obviously, the toolbox Europe had at its disposal was not enough to avoid this terrible war in Ukraine. But how do we envisage new toolboxes and new elements so that European countries can be secure, be they small or big? And here I talk about all of them. On Saturday, I opened the capital, or European cultural capital of Bodø up in the north. And normally, had it been 5 years ago, there would have been Russian participation at a cultural event like that. It wasn't. But perhaps culture will be, one element that can help reach out if there is one day that we can look at things differently. So we have to be vibrant countries also looking at how we constitute security politically. And for Norway, let me end on that, because it's often referred to. We are full capacity member of NATO. We will be contributing. We will be eyes and ears in the north. We will be supporting our Nordic, Baltic friends in our immediate geography. And we'll be partnering with our British, German, Dutch, French, North Sea, and of course American and Canadian friends across the Atlantic. But we are also working very closely with the European Union. We're not members, but we are security linked to the European Union through the same rules of the market. The EEA was never discussed as a security element, but I have always strongly believed that if you're part of the same rules and regulations for how the economy works, you are in a way part of a security infrastructure. And when we are going to deal with China and WTO and other global issues, we are part of that European partnership, and we are sharing the same ideas. And now we are doing combined work with our European partners on supporting Ukraine. We are part of the same initiatives to strengthen our military ammunition capacity, working very closely through different mechanisms. And we have a very extensive green alliance with the European Union, which is part of our energy and climate transition. So I will end on that. The military dimension will be a key component of securing our security, national security, but it also have to take a broader perspective, because security in these years is increasingly interconnected with other spheres of society, which makes it no less inspiring and interesting to work on. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for a very great speech talking about both the military, the moral, and the political preparedness that we need to have today facing this new security environment. Time is running very fast. I had planned for a lot of questions from the audience, but I don't think we have time for that. I have 2 questions for you before you have to run. The first is, we were standing here last year talking about NATO being more united than ever because of the war in Ukraine. How do you see the alliance unity today? Do you see any cracks, any splits in the support to Ukraine from our allies?
Well, first of all, I think it's remarkable to sum up to see how we have been united as NATO members. This has not been a NATO engagement and operation, but it has involved all the NATO countries. So we have met in settings which are not NATO specific, but they are contributing with contributions from all NATO countries. I think that has been successful. Then secondly, I think, I would caution against being surprised that there are debates in European countries and in Northern American countries, because these are major issues involving money, personnel, security, and if this was kind of a unitary song, it would have been not a democratic version of it. First point. I think Europe has been remarkably united. I think that countries that kind of, and political forces that came to to power with a skeptical message soon found their place in this bigger unity. And then, of course, a lot of questions are being asked about the US. Will they be able to agree on a Ukraine package in Congress? Will they be able to find a way? Obvious reasons, I will not speculate too much on that. It is a concern, because it's the major contributor. So from a material and financial point of view, were that to stop, it will of course have very profound consequences. That being said, I think that we have seen over time that if we go to the core of what is a country's interest, I've always believed that NATO is so much in the US interest. To be the leader of an alliance, having now perhaps 31 allies among the most advanced countries in the world, is not a capital you give away. It's a capital you want to use. And of course, you can use it in different ways. But I hope, and I think together we are able to see what the stakes are here, what the consequences will be if we fail. So that has to be the spirit.
It is not only Norway that has built down its military during the last decades. A new study done by NUPI, who has gone through all the assets and capabilities that our main allies, the UK, the United States, have, conclude that it's not... maybe it's not that they can come and help us if we need it in a crisis. Particularly if it's many crises at the same time. And Patrick Sanders, the chief of the UK army, complains that the army in Britain is smaller than it was in the Napoleon times. So how do you see, you said we need allied support in a time of crisis. What can we do ourselves? And how can we, rely on that in the future?
Well, I think I spoke about that. We have to put our defense in order. We have to make our structure work. It will need more resources, more people, better ammunition. But there's no way going to make an equation to say that and that's it. Yep. So we're fine. It's Norway. That's why we've been there since 1949. So that's why we have to be a major contributor to NATO, so NATO can see that it's not a one-way traffic. But then we also have to plan for what it means if there is a security need of being a member of NATO. That's why the updated plans that were voted and agreed in Vilnius, that's why the work of the military committee, of our people working together here, has to be part of our defense. So I'm enlisting in our national defense, the NATO collective security, our bilateral agreements with key allies that are especially North Sea, transatlantic, very important, and now the Nordic dimension. So there are different pieces of the cake which is called collective security. And I think it is the finest equation you have in modern societies, that democracies come together and say this is collective security. But it is not something you do once and for all. And if the British chief of the army is saying that, it's different now than 20, 30 years ago, well, that may be. But we have to take as a point of departure, where are we today? And what do we need to realistically plan for that capacity? And that's why we are putting a lot of emphasis and investment into that reception capacity. That we can receive ally support, and that it's prepared for ally support. It makes sense to receive ally support, not only for us, but also for the rest of the alliance. Because I believe were Norway to be in a situation where we really need that kind of support, it would not only be a Norwegian issue, it will be a major European issue. So that's why the interdependence and the collective security is so key.
I have to end by asking you the same question as I asked last year. Why do we wait until 2026 before we use 2% of GDP for our defense?
Same procedure as every year.
It is.
Well, I think, if you go in and look at how you plan your budgets, it's a major undertaking, And I said we will be there in 2026, perhaps before. It depends a bit on, how economy fluctuates. We have put more money into our defense budget to make, as I said, the current structure work better. But then we have the major discussion on what will the long-term plan mean for the next years to come. And as I said here, that is about making a choice of a major investment, which is, you know, a new paradigm for how we have to plan for our security. So we are listed now among those who are headed for 2% in a very short future. That's the immediate term, but then I think what our responsibility is really how do Norway put its hardware and software into the regional plans? How do we contribute to make the command, which is being developed, command structure? It is across the Atlantic in the US, but how do we make our own command structures fit with those structures so that we are really effective and operational? And how do we work bilaterally with our European partners and especially our Nordic partners to make that effective?
Prime Minister, thank you very much. This has been really great to hear your plans for the future defense and the future of Norway. And I wish you a good day.
Thank you.
So, we will have 3 panelists up to the stage. I will ask Stephen Lange to come up, Constance Stelzenmüller, and Stian Jensen. Please, take a seat. Please, Stephen. Constance. I have asked the 3 panelists to prepare some remarks for opening a discussion this morning about NATO 75, past, present, and future. Stephen A. Langer is the chief diplomatic correspondent of the New York Times, now based in Berlin after 6 years in Brussels. He has over 40 years experience, Stephen, and has served almost around the globe and won a lot of awards and, prizes. I would like to start with you and ask you, what are the main period that NATO really was strong and made something quite remarkable?
Well, first of all, Kate, thank you and the organizers, Camilla, and very honored to be here. Thank you very much. It's my second time here, and it's always a pleasure to speak before an audience that cares, that's interested, that, you could listen to Taylor Swift too, but you also want to hear about NATO, so I think that's great. The Prime Minister, giving his wonderful talk, stole my line. I'm also younger than the Alliance, but barely. And I've actually, because I've just come from the Middle East, I actually sat down and prepared some thoughts here. Strangely, even to me, I've interviewed every NATO General Secretary since Lord Carrington, who I must say was one of the best. And I've watched their offices get decorated to suit their notions or obsessions. George Robertson's looked like a Scottish kid's notion of the Garrick Club. Anders Fogh Rasmussen, forgive me for the pronunciation, who had a kind of cleanliness fetish, designed his to look like an all-white hospital room. So they're all a bit different. Now after Jens, who has been so decent and dutiful and careful with Trump and the Turks, the most clever line, I think, which you probably all have heard, came from Kaja Kallas, who said, we all agree the next Secretary General should be a woman, should come from Central Europe, and from a country that spends at least 2% of GDP on defense. That's why, she said, Mark Rutte will get the job. Maybe. Ruud Lubbers thought he had the job too. And perhaps Mette Frederiksen thought she had it too. It's just a reminder that NATO is a collective alliance of one plus the others. no matter what anyone says. But all of the leaders I've met have been very serious about their stewardship, immensely responsible, but over what, one has to say, has changed over time, and sometimes, I must say, has seemed very vague indeed. The joke headline, of course, is NATO: change and continuity. That's an internal media joke. But my response has often been, if NATO is the answer, what is the question? And it is varied, publicly anyway. The last strategic concept shared by the late Madeleine Albright spent as much time on climate as deterrence. People insisted, if not out of area, then out of business. And it was Mrs. Albright, don't forget, who, as the Soviet Union collapsed along with the Warsaw Pact, supported disbanding NATO, too, in favor of the OSCE. And it was Ron Asmus, a wonderful man, instrumental in expanding NATO to the Baltics, who was also a fierce advocate of remaking the Middle East, another example of American hubris that has cost us all very dear. And the only Article 5 operation was in pursuit of al-Qaeda, which morphed over time into a bizarre, decades-long swamp of confused and contradictory goals, long after al-Qaeda itself had metastasized. And by the way, just speaking personally, I still feel a great degree of shame over Afghanistan. Still, in my mind, despite all the public insistence that NATO was open to partnership with Russia and even saw it as a strategic partner, I never believed it. NATO was always about keeping the Russians and their nuclear arsenal at bay. I know the old line, cliches are earned truth, about keeping the US in, Russia out, and the Germans down, but I lived in Russia, and I wrote in the early 90s from there about the anger, the hurt, the desire to reestablish importance, dignity, and empire, the lack of democracy, the ugliness of savage capitalism that would find an outlet as Russia recovered. So it was always there, and we were blind. I think too many of us were blind to it, and I don't know why. I always favored enlarging the alliance over time, but I was appalled that for years NATO had not even developed plans to fulfill its commitments to defend Poland, let alone the Baltic states. Vacuums create desire. And despite our rhetoric, we created that vacuum under the pretense of filling it. So I do not believe NATO's expansion pushed Russia over some weird edge. It was heading there anyway. Russia's problems are nearly entirely homemade. And I do believe the early Clinton outreach to Yeltsin was sincere and even generous. And I don't believe Jim Baker's line about not 1 inch was meant to include anything but the former DDR. So I believed in NATO, even if others did not. And like many Americans, and hardly just Donald Trump, and I covered Bob Gates' Brussels speech complaining about the lack of defense spending, I also felt Europe was getting a free ride, or nearly free. But now NATO is back. Is it really? I wonder. I mean, if I'm allowed to wonder. Trump lurks. But there's similar movements in most major European countries. As governments have had to deal with angry voters, new commitments, and NATO has expanded to Finland, and soon, maybe even today, the Hungarians may vote today, on Sweden. It makes the Baltics a bit more defensible, but NATO's commitments have expanded too, given fuller realization of Putin's imperial fantasies. Now, Boris Pistorius and Bruno Kahl of the BND are much more open lately in their warnings to an ambivalent German public that Putin may not be satisfied with Ukraine, that NATO must do more to defend and help, and in a few years might even test the Baltics. And they worry that NATO will not respond quickly or capably to such a test. I mean, having said all that, since 2014, NATO has responded, we know, not always speedily, not always convincingly, but increased military spending, though still too low, increased interoperability, but too slow, efforts to increase production but complicated, efforts to increase deterrence along Russia's borders with 4 more enhanced multilateral forces, with better equipment, etc., etc. But there's still a deep and even deeper dependence on the United States, and especially its nuclear deterrent. Strategic autonomy is blessedly now discussed as an enhanced European pillar in NATO, which is good, but is that enough? If the US gives less to Ukraine, or even cuts off aid, which I doubt, by the way, can Europe actually lead? Europe has prided itself as being a good partner to the United States over Ukraine, but can it take the responsibility to lead? And does it even wish to? If Trump wavers, will the nuclear guarantee hold? If he pulls out the US out of NATO, which I very much doubt, by the way, can there be a European NATO without the United States? And why not? God knows Europe is rich enough. Does Germany then develop a European nuclear deterrent? Or will different countries, Germany, France, and Italy in particular, give in to the old temptation to do an accommodation with Russia at the expense of others? So, 40 years, God help me, is a long time. I first went to Germany in 1981 to Hauptstadt der DDR. Spent 3 months roaming Eastern Europe in the time of Solidarność. I was depressed by what I found there. I first went to Moscow in 1985 when Gorbachev became Gensec, but I was optimistic, almost done, feeling that the world was somehow improving, that if it wasn't quite the end of history, communism was certainly hollow, the Soviet Empire was crumbling, the Vietnam War was over with some reconciliation with Washington, the Oslo Accords, and Mona Yule is here, promised some sort of better Middle East. Now all these accomplishments seem in question. The arc of history is turning back on itself toward arrogant regional empires led by strong men, and democracy itself is in trouble. At least, however, we are again aware of one thing. If NATO is the question, we are reminded of the answer. Thank you. Sorry to go on.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you so much. We will go to Constanze. Constanze Stelzenmüller is the director of the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution in Washington. You can read more about her in our program. I've asked you, what does the US expect from its European allies these days? Stephen talked about Europe has to maybe go alone. Are they up to it? What does the United States expect from us?
Well, thank you very much for this kind introduction, Kate. It's lovely to be here. Last time I came to this conference was indeed at the Leangkollen complex, beautiful but very far outside of town. So it's nice to be here in the middle of town in this extraordinary room with its extraordinary imagery. And it's always good to be back in Oslo. And to see lots of old friends here in the first row. Hi, everyone. You know, in the field that we all work in, one develops a sense of irony over time. And so it is a reinforcement to that sense of irony to be asked as a German to speak to people here, to your audience and to you, about US expectations from Europe. I remain a German, although I've lived in Washington for the past 10 years, working at the Brookings Institution. Still only one passport, in case some of you were wondering. I'm there on a visa. But it's my third time living in America, and as some of you may know, I used to be a defense and security editor, journalist like Steve. I was defense and security editor of Die Zeit in the 90s into the middle 2000s, and so I have some experience of these early days of out-of-area ventures, of covering Somalia, genocides in Rwanda and the Balkans, and Afghanistan. My first trip to Afghanistan as a journalist was in January of 2002 when things were still a little sketchy. So my own lived personal experience encompasses this this period. And I remember very well the sense of absolute certainty that we all shared, that collective security was really a matter of the past, and that the business and the business of NATO for the foreseeable future would be bringing peace, stability, and hopefully democracy to faraway countries of which we knew nothing. The thought of the fight not just for security, but for stability and peace, and yes, democracy, coming back to our own countries was absolutely alien to us. And yet here we are. Right? And the fact that we would be asking this question of countries who started a world war and perpetrated a Holocaust, like Germany, that we would be asking this question of the future of our democracies, of two of the oldest democracies in the West, namely the UK and America, was also completely unimaginable at the time. And so, yes, all of this serves to deepen an already fairly well-developed sense of irony, right? There is a sense of coming full circle, of having to defend things we would never thought we would have to defend. And so here I am talking to you about American expectations of Europe. Now, I thought it would perhaps be most helpful to talk a little bit about the period that we find ourselves in America, which is we are, of course, in an election campaign. So there are two answers to the questions of what the US expects of Europe, and that is what the current administration expects and what a possible Republican administration might expect. And lest you wonder, I am not going to chime into what I perceive as an increasingly problematic song of everything is already predetermined, there will be a Trump administration, and everything that's happening now is leading us inexorably towards that path. I don't think that's true at all. I think there are so many open variables in this particular election season, in fact, many more than we have seen in the past. If there's one thing I think that is certain, is that we are at the cusp of a massive generational change in America, with massive political consequences that I personally think we're not looking at closely enough, right? We keep obsessing about the candidates and about their programs, but what we're not seeing is that this country is about to change quite drastically. And that is what I think we should be paying a lot more attention to. The one thing, however, that is certain in the current moment is that a certain Donald J. Trump's hold on the GOP is complete. That is truly extraordinary, particularly for somebody like me who lived through the entire Trump administration 4 years ago, which was a remarkable experience. I used to joke half-heartedly that it was like living on the shoulders of a volcano. Every day, you never knew what kind of eruption would be happening at any time of night or day. And the other thing that's remarkable about this political period, of course, in this face-off, is that you're not just seeing a face-off of candidates, parties, political camps, worldviews, but of really often hermetically sealed-off versions of reality and truth. That, too, makes it very difficult to have these discussions. That, too, supports my contentions that we are speaking of two Americas. Now, imagine if we had, what would be the expectations of Europe if we had another Biden victory or another Democratic victory? You notice that I am being careful here. I think careful because of what American commentators refer to tactfully as the actuarial risk of having two candidates who are older than the alliance. And by the way, just to make it very clear, I'm younger than the alliance. Didn't want to leave any doubt in your minds about this. We've seen with the Biden administration a team of policymakers who have an extraordinarily sophisticated take on international affairs. They're pro-NATO, they're pro-Europe, they're even pro-EU. I've never seen an American administration work this closely with not just us lot in Europe, but the European Union, Brussels, and Ursula von der Leyen. Truly remarkable. That said, they have also been notable for their prudence and their fear of escalation, and nowhere is that clearer than in the way that they have been conceptualizing strategy for Ukraine. They are also currently struggling with the war in Israel and Gaza. That is clearly, this is where for the first time we're seeing the Biden administration, I think, at the end of their really quite extraordinary political capabilities, struggling with the not just bilateral and regional but global implications of a war that has, I think, tested all of our capability of empathy, understanding, and horrifies us from day to day. And something that I've written in analysis of this, of the Biden administration's foreign policy, is that if there's one sort of real failing that they have, and I think that's becoming very obvious in the context of the Israel-Gaza war, is that they do not seem to have a censor for the more archaic aspects of foreign policy, feelings, really. Anger, hate, fear, enmity. That, I think, eludes their imagination, eludes their ability to strategize for, and I think it's something that our adversaries are exploiting. So I think if a Biden administration or a Democratic administration came back in, it's entirely possible that this would be an administration that would be overstretched, distracted, and have a limited ability to engage, including with a Europe that it is in intense agreement on in terms of values, strategic preferences, and policy goals. And that is important to keep in mind. Now, as for a Trump victory or a Republican victory, the conventional mode of analysis in Europe has been to focus on different tribes of Republicans, the primacists, the prioritizers, and the restrainers. And I think that that analysis misses the point. It misses the point because all three of these tribes, while they still exist, they're not irrelevant. They are far less relevant in the current mode because essentially the MAGA camp of the Republican Party is fully in control. Whatever there is conventional in the GOP, and that appears to be mostly concentrated in the Senate of the United States, is on the defensive and fighting against a MAGA camp that is not just in the ascendancy, but is far more disciplined, far more organized, and far more capable of setting policy goals and then following through on them than it was in the previous instance. And I think the other thing that is new about this situation is that the MAGA camp is not about a certain flavor of republicanism. It is about constitutional regime change. That is the title of a recent book by Patrick Deneen, and by regime change, I mean changing the nature of the American constitutional order. That is not alien to American constitutional tradition. In fact, the Puritans were fundamentally totalitarian in their outlook
Yes, they
on both the way they governed themselves and on their relations with the rest of the world, except that they didn't have the capability to go on imperial wars. But Puritanism is a fundamentally totalitarian, at the end of the day, mode of ordering things. And this particular group, the MAGA right, is about ending the disestablishment of church and state, about ending constitutional checks and balances, ending political pluralism. And if you think that that wouldn't have consequences for America's foreign and security policy, then I have a bridge to sell you. The model for this system is Hungary, Viktor Orban's Hungary. Viktor Orban, who has created effectively a one-party state and ended political pluralism in Hungary. That is what these people want. And I'm not suggesting that they would have an isolationist foreign policy. I don't think that at all. I think they would have a ruthlessly transactionalist foreign policy. And in that context, allies would be people to exploit. That would be also true for Europe. They might decide that they need allies. They might decide to talk to us, but that doesn't mean that they would treat us as partners. I think that's very important to understand. And if any of you listen to Trump's rally speeches, you will have heard him say that he is against supporting Ukraine, that he would force Europeans to increase defense spending, etc., etc. We have been there before, and if there were a second round of this, it would be not just more of the same, but it would be a much more intense, no-hold-bars, no checks and balances version of more of the same. I know that some of you will now say, oh, but wait a moment, didn't Trump, increase engagement in Europe? Didn't he send more American troops to Europe? Yes, that was because there were senior administration officials who provided checks and balances, who provided some semblance of rationality. What we're seeing now is a MAGA political machine that is far better organized, that is far more powerful in the way that it operates, and GOP operatives, traditional GOP operatives, senior Senate staffers will tell you that. And the thing to keep in mind is that even if the Democrats win the next American election, which is, I think, a possibility, then you would have that as the opposition. And that, too, would make a Democratic administration inward-looking, overstretched, exhausted, and again, increase the pressure on Europe. I've already into overtime, I'm very sorry. I do want to say that, again, nothing here is predetermined. I think it's entirely possible that what we're seeing now in America, these really quite violently different camps opposing each other, will create a degree of political mobilization that will, I think, put what we saw in the last election, in the shadows. And that it is entirely possible that that American democracy will win here again. I think if the hundreds of thousands of Germans could march against the AfD, then I think Americans can certainly mobilize against an anti-constitutional MAGA right. I believe in America's capability of doing that. But I will say this to you. Some of you may have seen the piece by Bob Gates in Foreign Affairs, where he described the darkening international strategic landscape and said the following: never before has the US faced four allied antagonists. I probably wouldn't say allied, I'd say aligned, but yes, all right. Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. Not since the Korean War, he wrote, has the US had to contend with powerful military rivals in the US and Asia at the same time. And he finally added, no one alive can remember a time when an adversary had as much economic, scientific, technical, and military power as China. Now, my final point is very simple. What stands between Europe and this landscape that Bob Gates describes is America. Now imagine America is no longer there. It's on us. The challenge of the day is for us to deal with this situation in case America is not inclined or not able to stand between us and all this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Constanze, for this very severe warning. Europe has to step up. Stian Jensen, I asked you to prepare something on NATO on its road to Washington, D.C. You are just returning from the United States. You have been there with Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg last week. You visited also a lot of Republicans, Heritage Foundation, and what is your impression? You are, as well known to most of us here, the director of the private office of NATO Secretary General and a good friend of the committee. Please, Stian.
Kate, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be with you here again. This is a fantastic conference. I would agree with those who say that we appreciate that you moved it into the city center. It makes for easier accessibility. I'm going to say a few words about some of the key priorities towards the Washington summit, but let me just first of all say that, it's very easy to paint a gloomy and dark and bleak picture about the security situation we are faced with and also some of our internal issues. But I fundamentally also think there is another more positive outlook, which I actually think we need to deal with. Our enemies are not necessarily 10 feet tall. Nothing is predetermined. I feel actually pretty confident that the US will continue to be engaged as a NATO ally regardless of who wins the next presidential elections. We should not forget that there is a strong web across the Atlantic of bilateral, multilateral affairs, a NATO organization at the heart of it, 70,000 American troops in Europe. This is not something that you pull up in a matter of years, even if you wanted to. So I just think that we need to keep a sense of perspective here. I would also say this, that I think that if Trump were to be re-elected, nothing is predetermined in the outcome of what that might lead to. And Europeans have agency in this. Some Europeans speak as though they have a complete abdication of responsibility, say, but whatever we do, this is the end. I tell you, if that's the take, then yes, you make it a foregone conclusion, and you make it a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because what we're actually seeing now is a US administration currently which has put allies and partners at the heart of its strategy. At the same time, you see in Europe, you see Europeans talking about it almost as a foregone conclusion that somewhere down the road, we cannot trust the US. So at the moment, what's undermining the transatlantic relationship is not actions on the part of the US, but it's actions on the part of the Europeans to something that is yet to take place, and which may never take place. So I just think that we need to take a deep breath and actually look at some of our strengths and some of what we actually have going for us. And let me just start with one point, is that I think it's important to understand that NATO over the past decade has transformed fundamentally. It's often overlooked. But we used to do operations abroad. Now we've shifted to collective defense at home, light deployable forces to larger formations. We used to have a more or less specific military outlook. Now we have a broader societal outlook, cyber defense, societal resilience, a broader sense of security. We've strengthened relations with the European Union to an extent that's never happened before. We brought new members in, not least Finland and very soon Sweden. And we've engaged new partners in the Indo-Pacific, and that brings a kind of coherence and commonality to not only the transatlantic relationship, but actually to the wider West that we haven't seen previously. And of course, allies are spending more on defense, a lot more. And we expect that a majority of allies will be at 2% or above this year. So I think let's recognize that, at least as far as NATO is concerned, we have a fundamentally transformed alliance, and one that is actually capable of taking care of our security. In terms of the key issues for the summit, first of all, let me point to three: Ukraine, China, and the need to continue to strengthen our defense. But first on Ukraine. Again, there's a lot of doom and gloom on the battlefield, but I think let's remember where we started. When this war broke out in 2022, the full-scale war, most people thought, and we feared, that Ukraine would collapse within days and weeks. That didn't happen. On the contrary, they won the battle for Kiev, for Kharkiv, for Kherson. They've liberated 50% of the territory that the Russians originally seized. They've opened a corridor in the Black Sea. And as long as we continue to support them, there's an absolute possibility that they can stand their ground. This is, by any counts, far, far better than anyone had imagined when the war broke out. They've also inflicted a massive defeat on the Russians. 300,000 casualties, massive amounts of military equipment. Russia is economically weaker, having to put its economy on a war footing. They're politically weaker. They are far more dependent on the Chinese. And of course, perhaps most importantly, the Ukrainians have actually made their choice. They've said that our future is in Europe, it's with the EU, it's with NATO. And that is perhaps fundamentally the strategic defeat for Russia. So let's not speak as though Russia is winning this war. They're not. They've already, in many respects, lost it. Now, in terms of the future for Ukraine, I mean, certainly, I have no idea when this ends or how it ends. I don't have a crystal ball, but I think two things are essential. And the first thing is that we have to keep supporting the Ukrainians. We have to break this understanding in Moscow that he can somehow outlast us. The way to bring this to an end is to support the Ukrainians and make it clear to Moscow that they cannot win this on the battlefield. The second thing I know is that when this war does end, Ukraine will need to be provided with some security guarantees for its future. Mm-hmm. We have to remember that this war didn't start in 2014, and we've seen a pattern of Russian behavior, which means that if we want to prevent history from repeating itself, Ukraine will need to get security guarantees. I think you can expect that when we come to the summit this summer, we will make decisions related to not only the support we will provide to Ukraine and the sustainment of that, but also to make it clear again that Ukraine will become a member of NATO. Allies have been very clear on that point. The second issue I just mentioned very briefly, China. We should not forget, obviously, Russia being the more immediate challenge, China, I think, the more bigger and long-term. And it's not only a US issue, it's also a European issue. You know, US concerns with China are also European concerns with China. We worry about their military buildup. We worry about their trampling on human rights, their destruction of democracy in Hong Kong. We worry about their assertive behavior on the international scene, be it in the South China Sea or in Taiwan. And of course, we have to remember that China is coming closer to us in cyberspace, by buying up our infrastructure, in the Arctic, Western Balkans, Africa. So China is also very much a European concern. And it is an issue, I have to say, that I think we've seen a great convergence of allies' views in the assessment of what China represents over the past few years. I think there used to be quite actually a big chasm between the US on the one hand and Europeans on the other. We're not really seeing that anymore. I think, as I said, there's been a major convergence of views. And of course, one other development that we've seen in the last years is that our Indo-Pacific partners, Japan, South Korea, Australia and Japan, have become among our closest partners. And then again, I think we should also remember that the strong and growing partnership with Russia and China just means that we cannot look at our security in isolation. What happens here in Europe affects Asia and vice versa. The last thing I just point to is we need to continue to invest in our defense. I think it's important, though, to say at the outset that we don't see any immediate military threat against NATO allies. That's not to say that, we obviously see the security environment we have. I mentioned China's military buildup, and of course Russia to some extent weakened by the war in Ukraine, but I think arguably also more dangerous. And on having put their economy on a war footing, war can potentially take on a rationale of its own. So they're much more dangerous. And let's be clear, I mean, the only reason why there is no direct military threat from Russia to NATO is because it is a war that I believe Moscow knows that they will lose. So we need to ensure that that continues to be the case. And that means that we need to resource our new defense plans. It means we need to get our production up in terms of military capacity. I think the Ukraine war has shown that we are woefully short in some areas. And it also means that at the end of the day, we need to spend more on defense. As I mentioned in the beginning, I think we now have about a majority, I think this year at 2%, but also those who are not at 2% are actually very, very close. So the spending and burden sharing issue is a very different story now than it was only a few years ago. So those are at least three key issues that we see for the summit: Ukraine, China, and continuing to build our defenses. But again, I would end with this, that I think it's very, very easy to point to our weaknesses and potential divisions. And questions have been asked about the transatlantic relationship ever since its inception. But I think it's more resilient than we might think. And the reality is that together we represent 50% of the world military might, 50% of the world economy. You add on close partners like Japan, South Korea, Australia, that figure grows significantly. And as long as we stick together, we have every opportunity to deal with what is a very challenging security environment. I don't mean in any way to belittle the challenges we face, but I also think we should recognize that we have a pretty substantial capacity in dealing with it. I think I'll leave it at that for as part of the introduction. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I will also give the audience a possibility to ask questions. We have 10 minutes left, so please just give me a sign. But Stephen, first, you have heard two different views on the reality here from Constance and Stian. How do you see it? Do you see Constance said that maybe if the Republican wins with Donald Trump, we will see a transactional foreign policy. Maybe they want to keep us as allies, but don't treat us as partners. Could you comment on that? And I will find someone in the audience who will ask you some questions.
Well, happily, I met Donald Trump in 1988, and he was not very different than he is now, only a lot less powerful and a lot skinnier. And he also made more sense then. I mean, he's had his dementia issues also. Look, I don't think the Republican Party wants to lose Ukraine, first of all. I know the Senate does not want to get out of NATO. And I just don't think this is real. Now, the question of confidence, since NATO is about confidence, deterrence is based on confidence and trust, that's a different question. You know, if people begin to doubt that America would respond in a collective fashion, then that undermines NATO, that's for sure. But I don't see it, and I don't see Putin trying, to be honest. I mean, he's pretty practical, and he's got his hands full right now. And for him even to test the Baltics, I think, would be a very foolish thing for him to do. So I think he's essentially rational. He's unpredictable, but essentially rational. And he has a very good idea of what nuclear weapons mean. And I don't share that anxiety so much. But I do believe a Russian victory in Ukraine would have serious consequences toward the credibility of the West in general. And I think it's really important. This year seems to me the year of holding the ground in Ukraine. It's going to be very difficult. Another mobilization, more retraining. Will there be another offensive, counteroffensive at the end of the year or early next year? There are a lot of Western capitals, including the Biden administration, I think, who hope for an impasse that at least convinces the Russians they've gone as far as they can go and need to talk. That would seem to be what people would like. That's certainly what Germany likes. But these things are all unpredictable. So yeah, I mean, I worry about Trump. I mean, I worry about the idea of Rick Grenell running foreign policy, you know. I worry about the heritage papers, but there is this thing called the Senate and the House, and they are an equal branch of government, and they are supporters of NATO.
Thank you, Stephen. Let's hope for that. Karsten Friis. And I will collect 3 questions, and then we will end.
Well, thank you, and good morning, everybody. Constance, I would like to ask you, let's look not on the Trump, but on the potential Biden 2.0. You know, one of the criticism of the Biden administration when it comes to Ukraine is this absence of a strategy, really. I mean, as long as it takes, right? As long, what is it? Do you think we will see a more kind of visionary, strategic Biden administration when it comes to Ukraine in case of re-election?
Thank you. And Julian Lindley-French.
Thank you, Kate, and good morning, everybody. I don't want Europeans to use Trump as an alibi. And we have this debate about the 2%, but the 2% was agreed in 2014. In fact, it predates the NATO Wales summit. If Europeans carried out their own defence planning assessment, Stian, what would be the kind of figure that Europeans should be spending to create credible defence, irrespective of arbitrary financial objectives?
Thank you. Do we have one more question? Or I go back to the panel. Please. Stian,
Do you want me to start?
we can start with you.
Well, Julian, I mean, I think in terms of the 2% target, you're absolutely right. Of course, it actually predates the Wales summit, and of course, during the Cold War, it was 3%. I think what changed in 2014 was that this was elevated as a sort of defense planning guideline to a commitment that was taken at the highest political level. I wouldn't say that the figure is entirely arbitrary, because of course we do defense planning and we do cost out these things over time. But I think what we can fairly say is that I mean, what we agreed last year was to say at least 2%. And I think that's a fair assessment. I think it's very clear that for some European allies, spending 2% is simply not going to be enough in order to meet their capability targets. I also think if you look at some of the, especially enabling capabilities that we lack here in Europe, it's going to require an investment that goes beyond 2%, at least to acquire those capabilities. But I would also say this, that, you know, we agreed last year very, very defensive, very, very ambitious defense plans at NATO. And of course, one could wish for everything, and I'm sure Admiral Bauer would like to have everything in the inventory in order to make these plans absolutely viable. But of course, you always execute military plans with some deficiencies and some risk. So I think it's one thing is, of course, what we intend to have in our own inventory, which is massive, but of course we also need to look at what our potential adversaries have. And as I said, again, you know, here it's a matter of relative maths. You know, some of our adversaries, they're not 10 feet tall. I'm not saying we should underestimate the Russians in any way, but they've demonstrated quite shocking deficiencies in the way they've conducted the Ukraine campaign. So I think from that perspective, I think actually we have every reason to believe that our defense will be quite solid. But you're absolutely right that I think 2% is a bare minimum, and I think people actually recognize that.
Constanze.
All right, just to not leave any doubt here, I of course also think that we Europeans should be able to agree on our own strategy and security and defense plans on our own steam, right? And not use developments elsewhere as a pretext for unity. I mean, if we can't do that, honestly, what can we do? And I actually believe us capable of that. I'm also, however, sort of very aware of the narcissism of minor difference that very often hampers us from doing what we ought to do, right? I agree with you, of course, as well, that our enemies are not 10 feet tall. But they are very nasty.
I don't disagree.
I think that, no, but seriously, democracies, of course, as it should be, fight with one hand tied behind their back. And I think that we have struggled to comprehend just how brutal, sadistic, and ruthless the Russian adversary is. And in fact, I often get the impression that European publics, and American publics for that matter, are in denial about part of this. I think that what is going to be crucial for us in these very essential next 12 months is to understand that we are dealing with an adversary who sees us as an enemy, as an absolute enemy. And that has consequences for the way that we defend Ukraine and ourselves. And I do worry that we are not quite at that point yet, right? That we don't yet have the resolve nationally, as Europeans, as NATO, politically, militarily, to see that through, right? And what I am absolutely certain of, on the other hand, is that Russia will give us more reasons to come to that conclusion, right? In other words, I fear I would like us to come to these insights on the basis of rational analysis. My prediction is that fear will make us do it, right? Fear and horror, which has been a big driver of the past nearly 2 years. All right, if that's the way it's going to be, fine. Again, fear and horror are things that can also overwhelm analysts. And that brings me to your point, Carsten, which is that I do think that I don't think it's unreasonable to say that the very odd sort of mind meld between the Biden NSC and the German Chancellery in terms of fearing escalation, right, has been very bad for Ukraine and has forced us to agree as allies in Europe and in America at a level of consensus that has not been good enough for giving Ukraine what it needed when it needed. And I also want to say, I hope you're right, but are we sure that the Russians aren't capable of doing things that can create an upset on the battlefield for Ukraine? Something so startling, so brutal, so ruthless, that the Ukrainians stumble, fall back, and that we are paralyzed and incapable of responding appropriately. Have we planned for that? Do we think about that? I hope so, because I think it's possible.
Thank you. We are soon out of time. Stian, okay.
But 30 seconds on this, because I don't actually think we fundamentally disagree. And I'm not saying that the Russians are not a challenge. They're absolutely a challenge. And I think nobody who I work with have any doubt about what we're actually dealing with here. But it's a matter of, is it half full or is it half empty? And I tend to think that it's actually, in general, more half full than half empty. And I think that's where perhaps the slight disagreement lies.
Right. But look, disagreement is a good thing. Honestly, I found this very useful, so thank you. I think, panels where people agree with each other and everything are boring,
Great. We will now have a coffee break, but before that I will ask you, Stephen, we are here to discuss NATO 75 past, present and future. In 2012, the European Union was given the Nobel Peace Prize. Does NATO deserve one?
Does Bob Dylan deserve the literary prize?
Okay, thank you.